Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel where today we are doing a full, non-spoilery review of The Order of the Pure Moon Reflected in Water by Zen Cho. Now this is a 150-page novella that is considered a wuxia fantasy or action-adventure fantasy, martial arts fantasy. I've just seen it described as both of those. But as for the description, I'm just going to read you the description from the inside flap because it does a much better job than I ever could. A bandit walks into a coffee house, and it all goes downhill from there. Guet Im, a young votary of the Order of the Pure Moon, joins up with an eclectic group of thieves, whether they like it or not, in order to protect a sacred object, and finds herself in a far more complicated situation than she could have ever imagined. So let's go ahead and just jump right in to the world building. So there aren't a ton of details surrounding the world building as you kind of would expect from a novella. However, I do think that the author has a really good eye for the details that really help you set the stage. So it's not even just broad strokes, it's some of the small details that help you as a reader fill in the rest of the picture. And I think that they did a really, really nice job with that. Where I did have problems was more of the explanation of what's happening within society. So at one point there was an explanation of this war that is kind of going on, and I really struggled to follow who the different groups were and how they related to each other. However, at this point I'm going to call it a personal problem and assume that I just missed some details and not that the details just weren't there, because I do occasionally miss details. But it is something to note that some of this stuff is going to be a little bit harder to follow if you do miss some of the few details that are there. I would have honestly loved an extra 50 pages for this novella, just to really explore some of the world building as well as do some more character development. However, I think that the author did a really good job with the space that they had available to them. Next, let's talk about plot. So, okay, this is a little bit of a nitpicky thing, but the description on the inside flap is just a hair wrong in that Guet Im does not join the banditry group because of the sacred objects. She joins the group and then finds out about the sacred objects and continues on with them because of it. I know, it's nitpicky. I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned it. But this is a really interesting plot in that going in somewhat blind, only having read that description, is actually okay. Usually that is not enough for me to feel comfortable, and I really want to pretty quickly understand where we're headed for the end game. And I didn't get that, but it was okay. It was interesting. The plot kind of unfolded kind of like a flower where when we're pulling back one layer, we can see the shape of the next, of what we're going to be doing next, but we can't see much more beyond that. And I was okay with that. I never ever felt, so usually when in this kind of a thing where the description is pretty sparse, I get to a point in the plot where I'm like, I get frustrated. It's like, okay, but where are we headed? Where are we going? And I never felt that frustration. And so I think it was just really nicely done. It was a nicely done plot mixed with the fact that I really like these characters and I was interested to see what happens with them, that I never really felt that frustration. I really liked the resolution to the problem that they had, both the actual like resolution and how it was executed, and the ending was left a little bit open. It was, well, not even just a little bit. It was okay. I had a lot of questions at the end, but that's because of like we didn't have enough time to like really develop out the world or the characters, anything. And so when we got to the end, I thought of it as a nice resting point for this story, but there's enough that we don't have answers to that there could easily be another book that follows this one, and I would be absolutely here for that. Next, let's talk about the characters. So there are a ton of named characters, but a lot of them aren't that important. Like, they serve their purpose, but they don't really, it doesn't matter if you can't tell them all apart, really. The secondary characters where they have more of an impact on the story, it is easier to tell them apart and know their name, so that's good. But most of the masses you don't really need to know. There are two main characters in this particular book. So the first is Im herself. She is intriguing and mysterious, and we pull back the layers of her backstory, and it's really interesting to follow along because, like, we'll get a piece of information and we know that's not the whole story. We know that there's another layer to it, and we just kind of hope that we're going to end up finding out that piece as well. And even at the end of the book, I still think that there's more to her than what we got in this novella. And honestly, I loved this character. And if she appears, like, if she's featured in another book, I would 100% read it because I really liked her. The second main character I'm not actually going to name because it wasn't even clear that they were a main character until like 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through this book. But this person is also incredibly mysterious, but we don't know that the mystery exists. And then we start finding out about their backstory, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. But you don't necessarily think that anything is much deeper than that. And then you find another layer, and you're like, oh, okay, like there's more to it. And I think that that's such an interesting contrast to Im, and I just really liked like that contrast between these two characters and how we were doing essentially the same thing with them, but it was approached in kind of completely different ways. I really, really enjoyed that. The one thing that I did not love about the characters and their development is that the relationship between our two main characters the development was not explicitly on the page enough for my personal tastes. I need a little bit of explicit development. We were left to kind of infer a lot of their relationship stuff, and I'm not good at inferring, so I didn't. So when we got to the end and some choices were made, they didn't 100% make sense to me because I didn't infer that that's what was happening. And so again, for me personally, I needed a little bit more on the page explicit development. But I think that when I do reread this book, I will catch a little bit more of that and be more okay with this. But yeah, I did not love that particular part. Next, let's talk about the pacing and the writing style. I would say that this is a medium-paced kind of book, but a little bit more driving than what I'm used to. So you just kind of kept going along and until you got to the end. And I thought that that was very interesting, actually. I would not say that this is necessarily an action-oriented kind of book, which I am mostly stating because it is described, like wuxia fantasy is considered action-adventure fantasy. And I don't know that I would describe it as being action-oriented, but I also don't know how else I would describe this. So there you go. I will say, writing style-wise, the descriptions are pretty sparse. There's a lot of details that are just not given to us. And in some ways, it's okay. It works. So like with the world building, that works because we're given enough details to fill in the picture. The plot, again, like we're not given a ton of details, but it still unfolds in an interesting and nice kind of way. The only issue where I had was, again, with that relationship development between the two main characters. But yeah, so it is really sparse. It's supposed to be, it's very clearly show not tell, but there's not always even showing. It's just the reader is supposed to infer. So that is a stylistic choice and one I generally don't go for, but in this case, I was actually pretty okay with it. Like I definitely missed some stuff, but it wasn't anything majorly important. The other stylistic thing I will mention is that not all of the dialogue is proper English grammar. And I'm only mentioning this because it was a surprise to me and I definitely had to get used to it. It was definitely a choice, and I'm not like knocking the author for making that choice, but it may take a little bit of time to get used to. It doesn't crop up all that often, but it may take a little bit getting used to. And honestly, for me, I wasn't 100% sure that I had the correct interpretation. But it was fine. It ended up being just fine. Now for diversity, there is queer rep in this, as well as everybody is Asian, which would make sense. Everybody is either Tong or Malayu. So I thought that was really cool and also understandable given that it is Asian fantasy. And then lastly, let's talk about content warnings. So this is a little bit, I'm doing this out of abundance of caution because it is much more of a gray area. How your experiences are going to determine how you react to this. But essentially, somebody is dead named and misgendered. Now, usually that's not gray area, right? But in this case, the people that are involved in that scene belong to a subsection of society which is very accepting of the fact that gender is not a binary. And I mean, like, they tend to be really accepting, don't have a problem with it. Our character that was dead named seems to be fairly ambivalent to their gender and how people perceive them. And then when it was done in the scene where that person was dead named, it did hurt when they were dead named, but more of a, you're reminding me of a life that I was forced to walk away from, instead of I'm hurt because you're reminding me of a life that I no longer choose and you're not respecting my choice, if that makes sense. And so, given all of that, like, I can definitely see the argument that it's not really a problem, but at the same time, later, the person doing the dead naming refers to our character by a title that is associated with the profession they used to have. And at that point, our character does speak up and say, I'm not that person. That's not my profession anymore. And that could definitely be read as a soft, gentle rebuke to say, that's not my profession, that's not my gender, and that's not my name. And so I could see that argument as well. It's gray. But I did want to, like I said, abundance of caution. I don't want anybody to be taken by surprise by this. But that's it, you guys. I loved this book. I mean, I gave it, even with missing some of the details, I still gave it 4.25 stars. And I honestly just can't wait to reread it because I think that I am going to catch more and just enjoy it that much more. But that's it. Let me know down below if any of you have read this. Are you interested in reading it? Come talk to me. But that is it. So until next time, have happy reading and I will see you in the next video. Bye.